Hello, I'm Richard Bryant, Executive Director of Musco Center for the Arts at Chapman University here in Orange, California. It is my pleasure to welcome you to At the Musco, a free interactive online series that showcases the best in performance, production, and arts education here at Chapman in a celebration of what we call the art of community. Tonight, we welcome back one of our most beloved artists, violinist, singer-songwriter, pop icon, and activist, Kishi Bashi. Kishi Bashi, or K as we call him, has been a valuable collaborator with the Musco Center and Chapman University as a performing artist, a guest instructor, and a thought leader. We're honored to have him back for his second Leap of Art residency. K's visits to the ruins of former U.S. Japanese-American incarceration camps have inspired his music and his activism. Tonight, he joins us for a reflection on this moment in our history, and he's joined by two special guests. The first is Christine Kitano, professor at Ithaca College who teaches poetry and Asian American literature. Her poetry book, Sky Country, captures immigrant experiences of her grandmothers who fled Korea and Japan, and her Japanese-American father, who was incarcerated during the Second World War as a result of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order number 9066. Our host is Chapman University professor Dr. Rei Magosaki, who specializes in 20th and 21st century American and Asian American literature and culture. During her recent sabbatical, Dr. Magosaki completed visits to all 10 of the former Japanese American incarceration camps in the United States. As always, we encourage you to ask your questions in the chat to the right of your screen. And now, here is our host, Dr. Rei Magosaki.
Good afternoon. I'm Rei Magosaki, Associate Professor of English in Wilkinson College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Today, I am delighted to host online At the Musco series entitled Tsunami of Memory, ahead of the violinist and composer Kishi Bashi's residency and concert on October 23rd. Today, we're also lucky to be joined by Christine Kitano, among the new generation of poets to emerge in the last decade, to share with us her poems which grapple with the World War II wartime incarceration history in her poetry collections, Birds of Paradise in 2011 and Sky Country in 2017. So I have asked Christine to do a selected reading of her poems referencing Topaz War Relocation Center in Utah. And that is my simple introduction, but Christine, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Rei. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to read to you all some poems from my two collections. And I'll start with my first collection, Birds of Paradise. And in these poems, I do talk about the war relocation experience, though I do it from a little bit more of a distance. And then you'll see as I get into the poems in Sky Country, I get closer to actually reimagining that experience. So I'll start with a poem from Birds of Paradise, and this is called Lost in the Move. Lost in the Move. Photograph, ballet recital, age 6. The applause has stopped. The mothers and fathers have ushered their daughters home, draping crushed velvet coats over pink leotards. Waiting alone under the empty lights, I crouch down to the stage and collect shed rose petals. My mother clicks the camera by accident, trying to wind the film. Photograph, Aunt Chizu, age 22, Topaz Internment Camp, Utah, July 1944. Her smile is wide and sun-bright on the black and white film. She points to the laces of her saddle shoes. Tar, she'd say, 60 years later, shaking her head, it melted in the sun, sticking our souls to the ground. She'd smile again to herself and laugh. Your father brought his trombone. Photograph, 7th birthday. I pinch the pigtail of a large orange balloon and smile despite the fear I feel that at any moment the balloon will break free, slip away, disappear up a chimney of clouds. In the background, my father leans against the yellow porch swing and tips the lip of a glass tumbler, swallowing his medication with wine. So in my first collection, I talk a lot about my father, about my family, about the memories of the incarceration, but most of them are filtered through other people's experiences. And so these are 2 more poems that illustrate the sense of distance I think I felt with my father and my sense of distance that I felt to the stories of the incarceration. So this is called Picture of My Father as a Young Man. He's just about to stand, left knee to the grass, right foot extended, ready to push his weight up. His hands, large and sunlit, still betray a tension around the knuckles, a force that might form a fist. Years later, after closing his eyelids with a wet washcloth, a nurse will struggle to free the hospital sheet from his stiffened grip. But here he's in motion, finding his rhythm, curls swept high by a wind. And this is where I reference the incarceration most directly in this book. And it's based on stories that I had heard from my father and also stories that had been passed down from my grandmother. And this is called 1945, My Father Leaves Topaz Internment Camp, Utah. At war's end, my father, 19, rode the train from Salt Lake to Milwaukee to take a job killing cows. For that 1 year, he stopped eating meat. If you strike, he said, the hollow between the animal's eyes, and if the axe is right, the pain is quick. The cow's heavy collapse, the worst sound he'd remember. When the families were herded into trains with unknown destinations, my grandmother dressed her children in their best clothes in case they were being taken away to be shot. She might have shrugged when she saw the neighbors dressed in rags for the same uncertainty. So those are from my first collection, Birds of Paradise. And I knew that the incarceration experience was something that I wanted to continue writing about. But I did feel like in my second collection, I had to get closer to the experience. So I did a lot of research. I learned about the incarceration from history books and textbooks. And I talked to family to get those stories a little bit more directly firsthand. And so what I ended up doing was after all the research, I thought of a character who approximated myself at the time. So I started writing these poems when I was in my mid to late 20s. I had just moved to Texas and I was surrounded by women who were giving birth and having their first children. And I was thinking about how that experience, which felt so vital to them, would be layered onto the incarceration experience. So I took what was happening to me in the moment and I thought about what would that be like in this historical context. So I imagined this character who would have been a young mother during the incarceration, and I sort of trace her remembrance of the experience. So I'll read from Sky Country now, and this is a poem called Gaman, and the word Gaman is a Japanese term that loosely translates to endurance, persistence, perseverance. And it's a word that has been used to understand the Japanese American response to the incarceration. And I wanted to reimagine that term for this particular character. So this is called Gaman, and I imagine a person who is looking back on this particular moment. It was night when the buses stopped. It was too dark to see the road, or if there was a road. So we waited, we watched. We thought of back home, how the orchards would swell with fruit, how the trees would strain, then give way under their ripe weight. The pockmarked moon, the face of an apple pitted with rot. But of course not. Someone would intervene, would make of our absence a profit. When we came, the boat anchored at San Francisco Bay swayed for hours. The gauntlet of uniformed men so intent on finding cause to turn us away. And now again, we wait, we watch. Our American children press against us with their small backs, which gives us pause. For the sake of the children, we'll teach them to forgive the fears of others, the offenses. But what we don't anticipate is how the dust of the desert will clot our throats, how much fear will conspire to keep us silent, and how our children will read this silence as shame, however much we tried, we thought, to demonstrate grace. When the buses stopped, it was too dark to see the road, or if there was a road. It was night, and instead of speaking, we waited. Instead of speaking, we watched. So the next few poems I'll read is in the same character's voice. And this one imagines her in camp in February 1943. So this is February 1943, Topaz Concentration Camp, Utah, and it's written after a poem by Thomas Transtromer. In February, life stands still. The sky is empty, endless blue. Like a boat leashed to a dock, the body carves the same groove in the same circle of water. The skeletal trees do not meet our gaze. The mountains too are turned away. The snow's depth, as if a miracle, remains unchanged. No one comes to say hello or goodbye. Trapped in their own rhythm, cyclones of powdered snow wheel in and out through the cracks. But one day, something approaches the window. The children rustle from the corners. The eye strains to see what color blazes. For a moment, everything turns around. This is called Equinox. Equinox. Blame the late storm, or blame the earth itself, ice-stunned soil smothering the torn green shoots. Once we lived, but now an empty house, an empty field, an orchard emptying of fruit. At home so long, then by dawn we were gone. This dawn, Utah's mountains trimmed with a thin purple cold. But even this winter eases into spring. Elsewhere, water must rush forth. Mist clears, leaves must brighten to green. With or without permission, another season will pass. The fence leans its shadow, but for how long can one stand against what the natural world springs toward? This next poem I'll read, I think, is the last poem I actually wrote for the collection as a whole. And it was a poem that has gone through many revisions, and I was trying to portray the complexity of this speaker, of this character. And it's a struggle to write this poem, and I don't think it's quite done yet, but I do think it captures the complexity of what it must have been like to live through this. And it's called I Will Explain Hope. But not today, not when the wind carries only the voices of geese crying, but sailing far above our human heads. Down here, I'd swear I feel the earth's subtle tug on its slow travel around a distant sun. But I'd also believe time stopped within this patch of desert, that elsewhere lives go on making marked progress, but we remain stranded within a stalled circle, surrounded by a light that fails and fails to reach us. How far and fast it travels, this light that is already dead. How far and fast it must journey, the prayer whispered in the dark. What choice but to forgive such a brave failure? This is called Fireflies. Because they have never seen anything like it, the city children weave through the barracks calling us to come see. Our stories of fireflies in Japan must echo in their young heads how we picnic in summer heat to watch the lit bodies punctuate the dark. Better than Christmas, we told them. So when they pull us into the Utah night, how to tell them these pulsing clouds are not fireflies, but moths. Still, we chase them through the desert fields, the children cupping small fists around moon-whitened wings that collapse, not from the children's touch, but the sheer pressure of air. My mother would say the fireflies are the lights of soldiers killed in a war far away, their spirits now wandering the earth in search of home. But these are not fireflies. How to say fireflies don't come to Utah, how to say how close or far we are from home. How to say where we are at all. My daughter catches one, its brief body torn and flickering in her palm. I teach her the word hotaru, firefly. Together, we trace the letters in the dirt with our fingers. But the next morning, when she peeks outside, she cries to find the characters gone, the name on the earth already erased by the wind. So throughout these poems, I'm imagining the speaker both in the moment of living in Topaz and from a more retrospective view. And then this poem about the trees really imagines what it would be like to look back on this experience. It's called About the Trees, and it opens with an epigraph from Margaret Atwood, which reads, "Here is the handful of shadow I have brought back to you, this decay, this hope, this mouthful of dirt, this poetry." Somewhere in central Utah, off the loneliest road in America, grows a plot of scattered trees. That first fall, men carved shrubs from the surrounding mountains and transplanted them around camp. Sure they'd die, we were all surprised when, in spring, knuckles of green burst from the branches. The soil was grainy and soft as sand. The trees were a miracle, as if born from a handful of shadow. Maybe miracle is too strong a word. I once thought it easy to believe a vivid memory was all that mattered. But now sometimes I see the trunks skeletal and bare, the branches hardened to iron, or they're lush as evergreens in winter. How much depends on how we're willing to remember. Now I sleep in an air-conditioned room and watch television long past dark. And when they ask me about camp, I sift through memories for a funny anecdote, the food or the smell of the latrines. This morning, I woke before dawn. I stared at the clock's neon numbers, my hands again full of shadows. Believe me, the men were not angry, but when they dug the trees from the earth, anger bled through their hands. The men returned with the trees over their shoulders, the stunned roots aloft and curled into incomplete fists. So when I was looking over the poems for the reading today, I realized that that's a repeated image. That in Birds of Paradise, I describe my father's fists about to form, and then that image comes back here. And I think there's something about just that silence and the strong emotion that you always sense in some ways, but you don't always have direct access to that. So I hope that that in some ways coming across in this work. I'll read one last poem, and this is another poem that I was revising right up until the date of publication, or the date that they sent the book to the printers. And I couldn't quite find the right ending for a long time. And then finally I got to the ending that I have, and I feel like it's the resonant moment that I was looking for. So it's a short poem. 1942, in response to Executive Order 9066, my father 16 takes, no spare underwear, no clean shirts, pants, or good shoes. Instead, a suitcase of records, his trombone. This is not the whole story, and yet it is true. It is a story without an ending. And when I open my mouth to speak, it continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I feel the resonance at the end. It feels like the end of a piece, and this sort of moment, which is a treat. It's wonderful to hear these readings, and I really want to thank you. I appreciate it. So I can continue listening to this forever, but I think for the sake of this program, I will invite Kei Kishi Bashi in, and Kishi Bashi has been working with the Wartime Incarceration Project with us for a few years now, but he's also been working on Omoyari, the documentary and album now out. I've asked Kei to select some of his music, just like I've asked Christine. And so I will turn the floor to Kishi Bashi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's kind of like, well, first of all, thank you, Christine. Really beautiful poetry. I enjoy that very much. I guess I come from a different perspective in that, my parents are post-war immigrants. And so we really I have no direct connection or direct trauma, with the Japanese American incarceration. So to kind of summarize how I approached it, as an artist, as a songwriter, it was a struggle because of not having a personal connection. I tried to see myself in those shoes of like what it would be like to be, I treat it as a civil rights issue, something extremely relevant today about other rising immigrants and war hysteria. And I think what I found was that a lot of, as I grew up on the East Coast as a Japanese American, I was really kind of surprised to find there was a whole population of Japanese Americans who did not speak Japanese. And there's people on the West Coast, and I would meet them, and it would really seem strange to me because my parents had instilled a lot of Japanese culture and Japanese, and they wanted me to speak Japanese as much as possible. And we celebrated a lot of holidays and things like that. But this culture really, the community that I had met in the course of just throughout my life about the Japanese American community on the West Coast was really struggling to reclaim their heritage. And that really surprised me. I didn't really understand that until I really started researching it a lot. And I think that was one of the things that was the most sad and hurtful to me, is that, there was an internal and external suppression of language and culture in these camps. It's because you were the culture of the enemy at the time, which was unfortunately just unacceptable, and in an effort to assimilate, they would just tell their kids to be as quote unquote American as possible. And so this is the song when I visited, I had visited many incarceration camps. This is when I visited Jerome in Arkansas. There's two camps, Rower and Jerome. And this is a song, and it starts with a Japanese melody. It's about the loss of language and culture. It's called Theme from Jerome. So I wrote this little Japanese melody. After today, speak the new. With every word you walk from the comfort of my hands. 'Cause after all, we fight the war with enemies unseen. 'Cause here we are in Jerome. Kanashimi furete mo arata na uhi kokoro to wasurete. These words today, how many times I'd smile if you'd remember me with this song. Da, 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 There was a girl, she fell in love, and on the sun-dried lands it settled in, started again. And when they'd sleep, she'd sing this melody to her beloved sons, forgotten words from Japan. La, 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 la. Thanks. So that song, it's like my dad sings Japanese enka karaoke, so he just loved that. So he's been playing saxophone for fun, so he just totally picked up that melody. It's very Japanese to him. So, but let's see. So that was on my so my album Omoyari and the documentary of the same name is actually it's an ongoing project. The album came out, 2 years ago because it takes more than 2 years to make a documentary, and not 4 years to make an album. So the album, a lot of the songs and the improvisations I wrote as I toured incarceration camps and learned about not just Japanese American incarceration, but just my own minority identity as a modern Japanese American person, and a lot of times it's like I started off, as Christine, the poet, you look inside as an artist to kind of figure out, what resonates with you and how you can actually relate to people back then. And a lot of times, and everywhere I looked, it's very easy to get angry about the situation and to feel that trauma, as Christine said about her father's trauma and her grandfather, but her grandfather being a trombone player, that's something I can relate to because I'm a musician, is that like it doesn't matter who you are, what you do. They locked up every single Japanese American on the West Coast, into these incarceration camps. And so, but also what really inspired me was, it's very easy to write sad and dark music about it, but I also saw a lot of resilience especially like in the photos of Dorothea Lange and Ansel Adams. They would take pictures of them having doing the best that they can with their lives, oftentimes smiling. And that really confused me at first. As an artist, you think, how could you elevate this experience? The reality is, these are people who they weren't miserable every day. They fell in love, they had humiliating moments, but they also did their best to put on a good face for their children and their family and survive and thrive and eventually pick up their lives and to continue telling the story as survivors. And that to me, it was extremely powerful. And I like to focus on, so a lot of the songs I have, like this one is called Summer of 42, about a couple falling in love at Heart Mountain incarceration camp. This is in remote Wyoming. So the story is, I think they fall in love and then he goes off to war, comes back, she's not there. Just something that could have happened, so but this is how we can connect to them with our shared emotions and similar experiences. So What are the things we wanted, the same as anyone? Just a hand to hold a little, after all is said and done. And the days are long and open, 'cause I had a view of you that summer of 42, when I was in love with you. We counted stars above us, we dream as Xanadu. We'd sneak off to the desert, the sound of your fancy shoes. The first day that I met you, I wrote down in my book, I'm in love with you, I'm in love with you. I'm in love with you, I'm in love with you. The days have gone asunder, the chaos of the war made man of everybody, but our memories I adore. We named our favorite sunsets, but I remember very few. The summer of 42, when I was in love with you. The years have turned to ages, and I know you're someone new. I look for you with every breath, soldier wreck with solitude. I climbed to the highest mountain, and I shouted to our view. I was in love with you, I was in love with you. Thank you. ありがとうございました。Let's see. I have another song. Since it is the tsunami of memory. So tsunami is like a wave of utter destruction, and this is actually this is not the violin, but I have a tsunami violin in a song called Violin Tsunami, and it kind of struck me. I had a friend who made luthier who created the violin for me, and he instilled this. He had created it during the Daishinsai, the tragedy of the Fukushima, not Fukushima, but the tsunami of Sendai. And he was a Buddhist, and he had instilled the spirit of his a prayer into the violin, and that kind of really blew my American mind, as something that was very foreign to me, is to put your heart into a non-human object, but which is very Japanese, And so this is a song that inspired the violin, that inspired the song, now played on this. So. When our faith was on the edge of the waves of summer days on earth, memories of a setting sun would tell a different way to be And the second part of the song is about healing and elevation. When in love you're blessed to be, tending the winds of apathy. As an answer you made to the end of the cancer. That you never the sign you loved Everything.
Thank you so much. Wow. We're very lucky to have you come and visit us soon in person too, but I feel very privileged to hear this and host this today.
Oh, thank you.
I think I have many questions to both of you, but one thing I wondered was whether wartime incarceration history has always been something that you were aware of, or was there a particular reason that Christine and Kay, both of you, decided to pivot to a creative expression of this material? Was there a kind of dissatisfaction with the way that things were told, or what? If you could speak to your personal sort of input in your creative expression, that'd be great.
I could start, I guess.
Okay.
So as a post-war Japanese American and as an Asian American male in general, I grew up in the 80s. And I think that's when I first saw the exhibit at the Smithsonian, about the Japanese American incarceration. And I did a project about it in high school. And it kind of validated a lot of the insecurities I had felt as a minority, but then I think as incensed as I was at the time, I think I kind of put it on the back burner. And as Asians, I felt more and more comfortable with my identity. I think I probably, it wasn't as immediate to me, as I grew older, and then I established my career as a musician. And it wasn't really until the beginning of the Trump administration where there's a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric. And then, obviously there were some people in the administration talking about using the Japanese American incarceration as precedent for the Muslim ban. And I think that's when I was really angry again, because I felt an assault to my own identity again, and I think that's when I really dove back into really researching and making it a part of my creative life. That was about 4 years ago.
Christine, do you feel that 2017 or 2017 is when Kay starts working on this project, right? In fact, it happens to be when I started working on my own second monograph, which has to do with wartime incarceration history. But it could very well have been a reaction in a similar way. But Christine, with you though, you started writing very early. The first book came out in 2011. Were you at different places, and did the political environment influence you in any way?
Yeah, I think I have a different experience. So I grew up always knowing about the incarceration. My father was incarcerated himself, and his family was incarcerated. But in addition to that, he was also a historian and a sociologist and a scholar who wrote about the incarceration and taught about it. So I remember even as a kid, like, my mom would drop me off and I would go to class, like she would go do groceries or whatever. And I would sit in on my dad's classes, and I learned about the incarceration that way. When I was essentially being babysat, I was in these lectures on the incarceration. And I think that's primarily how I learned about it. It's not like he ever talked about it at home. It was not a personal thing that we talked about, but I just was always aware of it. And so it was just part of my history in that way. I knew I wanted to be a poet, so I went to college and I started writing poems. And as I think many Asian American or otherwise minoritized writers feel, I felt like to be a poet meant to write about not the incarceration, to write about things that felt a little bit more politically neutral, or to write about nature, or to write about things like that. So I tried for a long time to be that type of poet, I think. And then when I went to grad school, I had a little bit of a reckoning of, what are you doing if you're not writing about yourself, that you have important and valuable stories to share as well. So that was a moment for me when I decided, oh no, this is what I do want to write about this. And this is my story, and this is my family story. And I did feel like, my father had passed away and my other relatives were getting older. And I thought, if no one is engaging with this material anymore, what happens to these stories? And so I felt personally urgent for me to be writing in this mode. And then my second book, Sky Country, came out in 2017. And I do remember, so it was a year after the election, and I remember someone saying, that's good timing for you. Like, my material suddenly became relevant all of a sudden. And I was like, well, okay, I understand where that's coming from, but this has always been what I've been doing and what I've been writing about. And it's not, and I think the truth was that this material has always been relevant. We just weren't aware of it, I think, until it got thrown in our face in a certain way in 2016. And we were just suddenly, all of us, or myself, I was made aware of how urgent this material has always been.
Yes, I understand. In fact, it was a surprise to me that not very many literary historians had picked up where things were left off in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. There are, of course, book chapters, articles, but no big monograph which grapples with the multiple generations now of the literary expressions. And so what I find interesting about Kristen, your work is that in Sky Country, you talk about the hybrid family history as well, which I think is a new generation of Japanese Americans. It's very heterogeneous for the audience. All three of us have very different, we have Japanese ancestry, but we have very different relationships. And I myself came to the United States in 1998 as a college student. And so part of what I think I needed to do was to go to the sites to understand some things. And in that way, I relate to Kay's site visits as well. Chapman has funded my visit to all 10 sites. And so I have gone to Heart Mountain and the Jerome and Rower camps as well. But they are all very different. And that is one of the things that I think is very interesting. And Kay, I have a question about Heart Mountain, because I know that that is a very big site of inspiration. How did that project come about? I know that you spoke about the Arkansas camps, but how do you feel about the sites influencing?
Yeah, I mean, at first, I did go to, we went to Manzanar. So I took a big trip with Aaron Aoyama mm-hmm. and some other people from Brown University and mm-hmm. And Nick, I'm blanking on it, but anyways, a group of people from Brown University. A lot of them had connections to the incarceration. And it was difficult, to connect with a site. You go there knowing the history, but Manzanar, when we went there, was extremely pleasant and beautiful. It's right under the Sierra Mountains, and you feel kind of guilty because you're like, am I allowed to enjoy this space? And I think that's when we had a lot of discussions about like how how memory is really tied to the stories and the people, not necessarily the location, you know. And so so going to Roar and Jerome, you know, in the winter was extremely bitter and cold, but you know, you get a feeling of how it could have been for them at the time. But for Heart Mountain specifically, Erin, I think again, it's connecting with the people. Erin's a dear friend of mine, so you know, she was her grandmother was incarcerated there, and she goes there and works there a lot, and it's a beautiful area that I've connected with. My co-director lives in Bozeman, Montana, which I live part-time now, so it's very close. So that's how I got connected, and they have a great interpretive center that's just very supportive of my work. Yeah.
Right. So. In one of your lyrics, I seem to recall that no one should have been sent there. I'm paraphrasing, but no one. But that I feel like that was my experience of it, which was that it is very remote, all of these places, and so.
Yeah, they're usually in undesirable places, you know. I also feel bad saying that it's awful there because people live there, you know. So it's like even today. So you know, it's like, but for somebody from Los Angeles, you know, it was probably a shock, huge shock. You know, somebody who's just come from very temperate places. You know.
Yeah. So I had a question about form and why this particular genre. For Christine. So there is narrative fiction, which has been predominant, or memoirs, but you choose poetry, and you also reference Lawson Inada, the poet. And so I wondered maybe you could speak to us a little bit about what the form allows you to do, the poetry, and maybe Kay, if it inspires you to say more. That would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like that's also like in general, why did I go into poetry as opposed to another genre? I think, I don't know if there's anything specific about the poetry form for me that allows me to do something with this subject matter. I only know that I decided to become a poet, and I couldn't really look back at some point. So this was the lane I had chosen. I think that so maybe I can speak more to reading other people's poetry. So what do poets do for the Japanese American incarceration experience, perhaps that fiction or memoir doesn't? I think it is that, and I was thinking about this when I was listening to Kishi's work, like the love song, thinking about just two people falling in love in camp. I think it's that kind of experience that can get lost a little bit, that we lose some of that internal explorative, imaginative space. Certainly in nonfiction, of course, but even in fiction, I think we're so trained to look for narrative and plot and character. Whereas poetry allows us to go inside somebody's head in a way that, you know, fiction writers can get mad at me, but I don't think that other genres do that to the same degree all the time. So there's something really special about being able to speak without the constraints of narrative. I think there's something about that poetry allows us to do.
Yeah, and I can add that. Yeah, I think even as an artist, as a, you know, not having any trauma connected to incarceration, you know, it's like opening it up to any kind of artist is really important to keep this story relevant and to continue the tradition of connecting the modern audience with it. Because if you get locked into this one way of telling this story, I think that's when the story becomes static and just not uninteresting. You know, and I think it's really important to just promote any kind of art form, whether you may not know anything about it, you know.
Yeah, this is great. And unfortunately, I can do nothing except academic prose.
That's important too.
That I do believe that there is room in academic prose to be creative, but not in the way that you are able to perform and connect in such a direct way. And so I admire that quite a bit with both of you.
One thing Christine said earlier about being as a young poet, you had to be not non-Japanese, right? I think I can totally relate to that as a musician, songwriter. It's like I've performed when I started Kishi Bashi like 10 years ago, I was really, the boldest thing I could do was have a Japanese sounding name, and mix a little bit of Japanese. And I didn't want to be world music. I didn't want to be world music.
Right.
And I didn't want to, really, that was a fear. It was an insecurity on my part as an Asian American male. And also just like, I was afraid at the time. And it took me like 10 years to realize that, I speak Japanese. I'm connected to a heritage that I've kind of denied, in all the white spaces that I feel comfortable in. And so I can relate to that evolution.
That's really interesting. I myself also chose in my first book project, Asian American publishing history, which is quite neutral. And it wasn't until I accidentally passed Gila River Reservation and Gila River Relocation Center. They're overlapping on my way to Tucson to see a botanical garden there, that I realized perhaps I need to address this, because as a Japanese person, I can understand some of the texts that were written in Japanese, and in a way that, and at the same time, actually, I was doing a peer review of something that came in that said, the Japanese Americans who were miserable to begin with, which made me very angry.
Where was that from?
What dissertation?
A dissertation by somebody?
Which was coming my way to become published as a book. And I thought that there was some problems with the way that representation had been skewed perhaps at certain moments. And so I think poetry and music, your music, humanize these experiences in a way that I think is very necessary. And so I feel very privileged to host this today. But in the last iteration of this Musco series, the host asked if you were working on something that you wanted to share. And this is for Christine and you both, Kay, but I realize you're still in the production of the documentary. So perhaps you could speak to us about that, and maybe Christine, what you're working on now, as a perhaps maybe that would be the time that we have, but if you could expand on that, that would be great.
Okay. You want to start first, Christine?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on poems again. So I always start out after I finish a collection, I think, okay, my next collection is going to be about XYZ, and the poems are going to fit together in this way. And I always have this grand plan, and it never works out that way. And I think I am still fighting, in a sense, that feeling of what is expected of me as a poet, what types of subject matter will get me published in the right places. Like, I always have that looming over me in some ways. But I do have tenure now, which feels like a little bit of freedom. So
congratulations.
Thank you. So I do feel like that has freed me up to continue exploring what subject matter is actually really important to me, and figuring out what forms are really correct for me. So I've been working on these poems, and I've been looking more and more at my mother's family. She immigrated from Korea when she was 16 years old. And I find that kind of an interesting repetition in my life. So my father was incarcerated at 16, and my mother immigrated to the US when she was 16. So that seems to be an important number, a moment of immense change for both of them, and thinking about how that impacted their lives, and how I still see that in my life today in my relationships with my family. So I'm exploring that. And I'm also working on more and more what I would call craft essays. They are not exactly scholarly essays, but essays that detail the stakes as a writer of color. Like, what does it mean to write from this particular space? What do aesthetics look like for writers who are not white? And I'm really interested in just trying to contribute to that conversation.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Looking forward to that. So I think like what I've been doing is still working on this documentary, which actually is ended up beginning as a kind of a study of traveling to Japanese American incarceration sites, but really ended up more of a survey of being a Japanese American identity in America. So it kind of covers the immigration history, and then and incarceration, racism, and then consequent assimilation. There's a story in Chicago about how they're trying to it was the largest post-war resettlement community, so and then just how we can activate ourselves as Asian Americans to show solidarity to other marginalized communities, which is extremely important, to me. And so there's a tangential piece that I wrote for a symphony, which I actually premiered in Miami a couple of years ago, and recently in St. Louis Symphony and Seattle, I did this visual piece that's a 25-minute symphonic piece that covers the incarceration from removal to the incarceration. And I'm going to be performing that with Seattle Symphony in January, and then Virginia Symphony, and then hopefully a bunch of other symphonies in the future. And it actually contains the 2 songs that I sang today on guitar. So that's how they were written for this symphonic piece.
Okay.
And so maybe I'll just close out with an excerpt from a new song that I wrote
Yes.
recently. This is where I started to explore. This is a post when there's when the when Asian hate was really started to become the forefront again. After years after the murder, the gruesome murders in Atlanta, and I live close to Atlanta, and I know that area pretty well. And so it was kind of like, it's about being a minority in this country and how it always feels like you're kind of looking inward, like through a glass door that you can't really get through, or you're looking up to a place that you're not really welcome. And I think this is an excerpt called For Every Voice That Never Sang. Nothing more you can do. I heard the sound of your sigh. That's nothing to you. I could have laughed at it all, but nothing more, not a kid in which to cry. Took it all to the race, and I gave it to you. As I pause for a second to remember the very words, I've written them as symbols from a memory that occurred. There's a time, there's a place for us, for every voice that never sang, for everyone I trust. I'm with you. I belong with us to embrace with you. That's it.
Oh, beautiful.
But thank you so much for having me, though. It was a wonderful conversation.
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。ありがとうございます。
Thank you all.
Okay, so I think this concludes our session today. Thank you so much to Christine once again, and Kay, and I look forward to seeing both of you again at a different point.
Thank you.
Thank you.